Elena Marsh handed over $5 for a structure that had been rotting beside the tracks for 40 years. The abandoned train station looked like it should have been condemned, not sold. But when her tabby cat refused to cross the threshold, Elena discovered something that would shake Millbrook Valley to its foundation. Elena Marsh stood in the law office of Thornwood Associates, staring at the deed in her trembling hands. The afternoon light filtered through dusty Venetian blinds, casting prison bar shadows across the mahogany desk that separated her from Gregory Thornwood. $5. That's what the silver-haired attorney had asked for the old Millbrook Junction train station. $5 for a two-story brick building with boarded windows and a roof that sagged like a broken promise. You're absolutely certain about this, Mrs. Marsh? The lawyer's voice carried something Elena couldn't quite identify. Not concern exactly. Something sharper, more urgent. Almost like relief mixed with anxiety. As if he were passing off something that had been burning his hands for far too long. Elena was 51 years old and down to her last $190. Her husband James had died 11 months ago, leaving her with medical debt that had devoured their savings like wildfire consuming dry timber, their modest home on Sycamore Street, and nearly her will to continue. She'd been sleeping in her Ford Taurus for almost a month now, parking behind the Millbrook Community Library where the security lights kept her feeling relatively safe and where nobody would think to question a car sitting overnight. But Elena had worked in commercial real estate appraisal for 23 years before James got sick with that aggressive form of leukemia that doctors said was rare but treatable, right up until it wasn't. She knew buildings inside and out. She knew materials, structural integrity, market values, salvage potential. And that train station, despite 4 decades of neglect and decay, sat on nearly an acre and a half of land just 3 blocks from Main Street, right in what used to be the commercial heart of Millbrook Valley. The brick alone was worth several $1,000s if she could salvage it carefully and sell it to one of those architectural reclamation companies in the city. The copper wiring, assuming it hadn't been stripped by scavengers, could fetch decent money. The old brass fixtures, the aged lumber, the decorative ironwork. If she worked smart and methodical, she could sell enough to rent a room somewhere and start rebuilding her shattered life one piece at a time. I'm certain, she said, signing her name. Elena Victoria Marsh, with a steadiness that surprised her, given how her insides were churning with equal parts hope and terror. Gregory Thornwood slid the deed across his polished mahogany desk with unusual speed, his movements almost frantic. His eyes never quite met hers, always sliding away to focus on the window, the wall, his expensive fountain pen, anywhere but her face. His hand shook noticeably as he accepted the $5 bill, worn soft from being folded and refolded in Elena's jacket pocket for the past 3 days while she'd built up the courage to come here. It's yours then. The property transfers immediately. No waiting period, no additional paperwork. He stood abruptly, gathering papers that didn't actually need gathering, straightening files that were already straight. I have another appointment arriving shortly. You can see yourself out, can't you? The receptionist has already left for the day. Elena walked into the cool October afternoon clutching the deed like it was a winning lottery ticket. But as she reached her car, she glanced back through the law office window. Gregory Thornwood had returned to his desk and was reaching for his telephone with visible agitation, his face pale as chalk. His mouth moved rapidly as he spoke to whoever was on the other end, and even from the parking lot, Elena could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his free hand gripped the edge of his desk. That was the first warning sign. She ignored it because she needed this too badly to acknowledge what her instincts were trying to tell her. Elena's desperation. 3 weeks earlier, Elena had been sitting in her Ford Taurus behind the Millbrook Community Library at 2 a.m, counting coins into careful stacks on the passenger seat. $47.18. Her stomach had stopped growling 5 days ago, which meant it had given up asking for food. That frightened her more than the actual hunger, because she remembered reading somewhere that when your body stopped signaling hunger, it meant you were entering a dangerous stage of starvation. Whiskers, her 7-year-old orange tabby cat, sat in the passenger seat watching her with those knowing green eyes that seemed to see straight through her brave face to the terror underneath. Elena had rescued Whiskers from the county animal shelter 4 years ago, right after James's diagnosis when the doctors had explained they were looking at years of treatment, not months. The cat had been her constant companion through the endless hospital visits, the slow decline, the funeral she'd paid for with their last credit card, the one she'd maxed out and would probably never be able to pay off. "We'll figure something out, sweet girl," Elena whispered, scratching behind Whiskers' ears. The cat purred, pressing her head firmly into Elena's palm with that complete trust that made Elena's heart ache. She couldn't let this cat down. Whiskers was all she had left. Elena had applied for 62 jobs in 8 weeks. Grocery stores, restaurants, retail shops, cleaning services, hotel housekeeping. Anything and everything that might hire a woman her age with a 10-month gap in her employment history and no local references, because she'd spent the last 3 years either at the hospital or taking care of James at home. The responses were all the same polite variations of "we've decided to pursue other candidates," or "your qualifications don't quite match our current needs," or sometimes just silence, which was its own form of rejection. Her commercial real estate appraiser's license had lapsed when she couldn't afford the $800 renewal fee or the required continuing education courses. Her former employer, Hendricks & Associates, had restructured during her absence and eliminated her position entirely, replacing her with 2 younger appraisers who worked for less money and didn't need health insurance because they were still on their parents' plans. She'd sold everything worth selling. The furniture had gone first, piece by piece, advertised on local online marketplaces. Then James's tools from the garage, his table saw, his drill press, his carefully organized collection of hand tools that he'd been so proud of. Her wedding ring had been the hardest, but it had kept her fed for almost 2 months. Even her grandmother's china had gone to an antique dealer for a fraction of its sentimental value. All of it had gone to pay down medical debts that never seemed to shrink, no matter how much she threw at them. It was at the quick-stop gas station on Maple Avenue that she'd overheard the conversation that changed everything. She'd been standing at the counter counting out quarters to pay for a bottle of water and a pack of crackers when 2 men's conversation had drifted through the open door from where they stood by the pumps. "I heard Gregory Thornwood is practically begging someone to take that old train station off his hands," one said. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s wearing a contractor's vest with Daniels Construction embroidered on the back. The other man, younger and lean in paint-splattered jeans, had laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "Who in their right mind would want that death trap? Place hasn't been used since 1968 or 69. Probably cost more to demolish than it's worth. Foundations probably cracked, roofs definitely shot, and God knows what kind of environmental hazards are lurking in there. Still, you've got to admit the land's got serious value. Right off Main Street, walking distance to everything. If someone had the capital to develop it properly, tear down that eyesore and build something modern." Keyword being capital. Thornwood knows damn well nobody in this dying town has that kind of money to throw at a ruin. "We're not exactly swimming in investors here in Millbrook Valley." Elena's hands had stopped counting quarters. A building nobody wanted. Land with genuine value. Materials that could be salvaged and sold to reclamation companies. Her appraiser's mind had started calculating automatically. Brick at current reclamation rates, copper wire by the pound, architectural fixtures, aged lumber for that rustic look that was so popular now. That evening, she'd driven past the old Millbrook Junction station for the first time in probably 15 years. It stood behind a rusted chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, wrapped in shadows cast by overgrown trees and strangled by weeds that had grown tall enough to obscure the first-floor windows. The brick facade was stained dark with decades of weather and pollution. The windows were dark as dead eyes behind their boards, but the structure itself still looked fundamentally solid. The walls were straight, not bowing or bulging. The foundation appeared intact, not settled or cracked from what she could see through the fence. She saw possibility where everyone else saw only rot and ruin and problems. The next morning, hands shaking, she'd called Gregory Thornwood's office and asked about the train station. The receptionist had put her through immediately, which should have been another warning sign. The first visit. Elena stood outside the train station with Whiskers in her carrier and a heavy-duty flashlight in her hand. The October sun hung low and pale in the western sky, casting long shadows across the overgrown lot that made the building look even more abandoned and forlorn. The chain-link fence had a gap near the back corner where the wire had pulled completely away from its post, probably from years of teenagers sneaking in to drink or spray paint graffiti. Elena squeezed through carefully, her jacket catching on the sharp edges of cut wire. The building looked significantly worse up close than it had from the street. Graffiti covered the lower walls in layers, tags and symbols and crude drawings she didn't recognize. Someone had spray painted "Stay Out" in red letters 6 feet high across the boarded-up main entrance. The front doors were chained shut with a heavy padlock that looked relatively new, but a side entrance that must have been for employees hung partially open, one hinge completely broken, the doors sagging inward at a dangerous angle like a mouth caught mid-scream. Elena set down the cat carrier on a relatively clear patch of cracked concrete and pulled the door wider. It scraped against the floor with a sound like nails on a chalkboard, loud and sharp in the heavy stillness of the abandoned lot. That's when Whiskers started hissing. The cat had gone completely rigid inside the carrier, her orange fur standing on end until she looked twice her normal size, ears flattened against her skull, her green eyes fixed unblinking on the darkness beyond the doorway. The sound coming from her throat was primal and continuous, pure fear and warning, and something Elena had never heard from her gentle, sweet-natured cat in 7 years together. "Hey, it's okay, girl," Elena murmured, crouching beside the carrier and trying to keep her voice calm and soothing. "It's just an old building. Just dust and shadows. Nothing to be afraid of." But Whiskers wouldn't stop. She backed into the far corner of the carrier, body pressed so hard against the plastic that Elena worried she might hurt herself. Every muscle was trembling, her pupils dilated to huge black pools, and that horrible hissing continued without pause. Elena had never seen her act this way. Not during thunderstorms that shook the house. Not at the veterinarian's office with its frightening smells and sounds. Not even when a neighbor's German shepherd had charged into their yard barking aggressively. Whiskers was steady, unflappable, the calmest cat Elena had ever known. Until now. "Stay here then, sweetheart," Elena said softly, making sure the carrier was in a safe spot away from the door. "I'll just be a few minutes. Just need to look around, assess what we've got here." She stepped through the doorway alone, leaving her terrified cat behind. The air inside tasted wrong. Not just stale from decades of being sealed up, that she'd expected and was prepared for. This was something else entirely, something that made her want to gag. Metallic and cold and somehow thick, like breathing through a mouthful of old pennies that had been buried in dirt and dug up again. The temperature dropped at least 15 degrees the moment she crossed the threshold, and her breath came out in a visible puff of condensation even though it was 55 degrees outside. Elena clicked on her flashlight, the LED beam cutting through the darkness and illuminating a wide reception area with a cracked tile floor in a black and white checkerboard pattern. Old wooden benches lined the walls, their surfaces buried under what looked like an inch of undisturbed dust. A ticket counter stretched across the far end of the room, the glass partition clouded with grime and split by a long crack that ran diagonally from corner to corner like frozen lightning. She moved deeper inside, her footsteps echoing strangely in the enclosed space. The sound bounced back wrong somehow, with a quality that suggested the space behind the walls was larger than it should be, as if there were hidden rooms or voids that weren't part of the original architectural plans. She walked the perimeter slowly, testing floorboards with her weight, examining walls for structural cracks or water damage, taking mental inventory of what could be salvaged and what was too far gone. The building was surprisingly intact considering 4 decades of abandonment. No major structural damage that she could see in this first room. Some water stains on the ceiling tiles, but nothing catastrophic. No obvious signs of foundation failure. The bones were good, better than she'd dared to hope. She reached the back wall, the one facing where the old railway tracks used to run, and knocked her knuckles against it experimentally, listening for the sound that would tell her about the wall's construction and condition. The sound that came back was hollow. Too hollow. Wrong. Elena frowned and knocked again, moving methodically along the wall. Solid. Solid. Hollow. Solid. Hollow. Solid. The pattern made no architectural sense. She ran her hand slowly across the bricks, feeling for seams, for anything that might explain the acoustic inconsistency. Her fingers caught on something, a tiny gap where the mortar had crumbled away, leaving a small space between bricks. She hooked her fingernail into it, and pulled experimentally. A section of brick about the size of her palm swung outward on a hidden hinge that had been completely invisible until she'd opened it. Behind it was a metal handle. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she could hear her pulse rushing in her ears. She gripped the handle with both hands and pulled. A section of wall, roughly 5 feet wide and 7 feet tall, swung inward smoothly and silently on well-oiled hinges, revealing a narrow passage that disappeared into complete and utter darkness. From somewhere deep inside that passage, she heard it clearly. A sound like papers rustling, like someone turning pages slowly and deliberately in an empty room. Outside, Whiskers' hissing had grown louder, more frantic, almost screaming now. Elena stood frozen at the threshold of the hidden passage, flashlight beam trembling visibly in her shaking hand, and understood with absolute crushing certainty that Gregory Thornwood had not sold her a train station. He had sold her a secret, and whatever that secret was, it had been hidden here for 40 years. Elena Marsh had discovered a hidden passage behind the walls of the abandoned Millbrook Junction train station she'd bought for $5. Her cat Whiskers refused to enter the building, sensing something wrong. Now, Elena was about to learn that some secrets destroy everything they touch, and that Gregory Thornwood had sold her more than just property. He'd sold her a war. Elena returned at dawn with better equipment. A high-powered LED lantern, spare batteries, a crowbar, bolt cutters, and Whiskers safely locked in the car with food, water, and the windows cracked. The cat had clawed at her arms when she tried to bring her close to the building, drawing blood and yowling like she was being murdered. The hidden door stood exactly where she'd left it, that dark passage waiting. Elena stepped through, her lantern pushing back shadows that seemed to resist the light. The passage was narrow, brick walls pressing close enough that her shoulders nearly brushed both sides. The metallic taste in the air grew stronger with each step, coating her tongue until she wanted to spit. After 30 feet, the passage opened into a room. It was roughly 15 feet square, windowless, the walls lined floor to ceiling with metal shelving units. And on those shelves sat dozens upon dozens of bankers' boxes, each one labeled with dates ranging from 1955 to 1994. Elena pulled down the nearest box with trembling hands. Inside were documents, legal papers, property deeds. She spread them across the dusty concrete floor, her lantern illuminating page after page, and felt ice crystallize in her stomach as the pattern emerged. Every single document was a property deed for land in Millbrook Valley. Dozens of them. Prime commercial properties, residential lots, farmland, and every single one had been transferred to the same name, Gregory Thornwood. But the prices were criminally wrong. Elena had valued properties professionally for over 2 decades. She knew market rates, historical trends, comparative values. These properties had been sold for nothing. A 12-acre farm with creek frontage sold for $300 in 1967. That land should have been worth $80,000 even then. A downtown commercial building transferred for $500 in 1972 when it should have commanded $50,000 minimum. She pulled down another box. More deeds. Different families, identical pattern. Properties transferred to Thornwood for amounts so absurdly low they seemed like clerical errors, except they weren't errors. They were theft. Then she found the letters. They were bundled in the back of the third box, yellowed envelopes bound with deteriorating string. Elena untied them with shaking fingers and read by lantern light. Mr. Thornwood, my family cannot continue under these circumstances. Our well water has been contaminated for 6 weeks now. All 3 of my children have been sick. The county health department says they found nothing wrong with the water, but I know what I see. I know this started right after I refused your purchase offer. I will sign whatever you want. Please just make it stop. Vincent Castellano, March 1966. Elena's hands trembled as she opened another letter. Thornwood, you win. The barn fire last night was the final straw. We're leaving Millbrook Valley. You can have the property for whatever pittance you're offering. My family's safety is worth more than fighting you. Rebecca Oakes, July 1973. Another. I don't know how you're doing this, and I don't know who you've paid off, but the sheriff won't investigate, and the county inspector refuses to look at our farm. Half my dairy herd is dead, and nobody will help us. Take the damn land. We can't afford to stay here and watch everything die. Dennis Kowalski, September 1981. Elena sat back, surrounded by evidence of systematic terror spanning 4 decades. Gregory Thornwood had forced over 40 families off their land through contamination, arson, sabotage, and corruption. He'd built an empire worth millions on stolen property, and he'd meticulously kept evidence of every single crime. Why? Why preserve proof of your own guilt unless? The footsteps in the outer room made her freeze. Elena killed her lantern instantly. The footsteps grew closer, measured in calm. They stopped just outside the hidden passage. Mrs. Marsh. Gregory Thornwood's voice drifted through the darkness. I thought I might find you here. The truth. Elena had no choice but to reveal herself. The only exit was past Thornwood. She clicked her lantern back on and walked toward the passage opening. Thornwood stood in the main room, hands in the pockets of his expensive wool coat. At 74, he looked gaunt, his silver hair thin, his face deeply lined. He'd lost considerable weight since she'd seen him 3 days ago in his office. How long have you known about this room? Elena asked, stepping out of the passage. Since my father showed it to me when I turned 18. Thornwood's voice was steady, almost matter-of-fact. He built it in 1957. Said documentation was essential, that we needed to remember what we'd done, even if no one else ever knew. These deeds go to 1994, Elena said. Your father would have been dead by then. He died in 1989. Thornwood nodded slowly. I continued his work for 5 more years before I finally stopped. The guilt became unbearable. You could have returned the properties, made restitution, and accomplished what? Bankrupt myself? Spend my final years in prison? Thornwood pulled a folded document from his coat. This is better. He held it out. Elena took it, unfolding it carefully. It was a comprehensive deed transfer. Every property Gregory Thornwood owned in Millbrook Valley, 43 parcels worth at least $8 million, signed over to a trust. The designated trustee was Elena Victoria Marsh. What is this? Elena whispered. My confession and my penance. Thornwood's eyes met hers finally. I'm dying, Mrs. Marsh. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. 3 months at most. Those properties belong to the families my father and I stole them from. The documents in that room will tell you who they are. Return what's rightfully theirs. Keep what you need to rebuild your life. Do what I never had courage to do. Why me? Thornwood's expression softened with something like regret. Your husband, James. His family owned the Riverside Farm property, 18 acres on the Eastern Valley Ridge. My father forced them out in 1976 with contaminated irrigation water. James was 12 years old when his parents had to sell and move away. Your husband never knew the real reason his childhood ended. Elena felt tears burning hot tracks down her face. James had rarely spoken about the farm, had always grown quiet and distant when she'd asked. There's a deed in that room with the Marsh family name, Thornwood continued. Thomas and Dorothy Marsh, James's parents. That property is worth $1.2 million now. It should have been his inheritance. I can't give him back his childhood, but I can give you this chance to make it right. He turned to leave, then paused. One warning, Mrs. Marsh. When you start contacting these families, others will find out. People who've profited from the status quo. My former business partners, county officials who took bribes, developers who bought properties from me knowing they were stolen. They will not let this go quietly. They'll fight you with everything they have. Are you threatening me? I'm preparing you. Thornwood's gaze was steady and sad. What you do with this evidence will make powerful enemies. Be smart. Don't do this alone. Find allies among the families. Strength in numbers. He walked out into the morning light, leaving Elena alone with 40 years of documented crimes and a decision that would change everything. Gathering allies. Elena spent 2 days photographing every document, creating digital backups, organizing the evidence by family name. Then she started making calls. The first was to Vincent Castellano's daughter, Maria, who wept when Elena explained what had happened to her family. The second was to Dennis Kowalski's son, who'd always believed his father's dairy farm had failed due to bad management. The third was to Rebecca Oakes herself, now 86 and living in a nursing home, who whispered, I knew it, over and over. Within a week, Elena had contacted 32 families. 27 agreed to meet. They gathered at the train station on a cold November morning. Families who'd been scattered for decades, reunited by shared trauma. Maria Castellano brought her brothers. The Kowalski family arrived together, 3 generations strong. Rebecca Oakes came in a wheelchair, her eyes bright with vindication. Elena stood before them in the main room of the station and told them everything. Showed them the documents. Explained Thornwood's confession. Presented the deed transfer that would return their stolen properties. "This won't be easy," Elena warned. "There are people in this town who will fight us. Officials who were complicit. Developers who bought stolen land. They'll use lawyers, intimidation, whatever it takes to keep this buried. Let them try," Maria Castellano said, her voice hard as stone. "We've got truth in numbers now. They can't silence all of us." Resolution. 3 months later, Elena stood in the Millbrook County Courthouse as Judge Patricia Whitaker reviewed the evidence. The courtroom was packed with families, reporters, and nervous-looking county officials. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. The property transfers were fraudulent. The deeds would be returned to the original families or their descendants. Gregory Thornwood's estate would provide restitution for damages. County officials who'd accepted bribes would face criminal charges. Thornwood himself had died 2 weeks earlier. His final act a detailed written confession that corroborated everything in the hidden room. Elena walked out of the courthouse into bright winter sunshine. Whiskers was waiting in her car, no longer her only home. The Marsh family farm had been returned to her, along with enough settlement money to restore it. Other families were celebrating similar victories. The train station still stood, no longer abandoned. Elena had decided to keep it, to restore it, to turn it into a community center where the families could gather and remember. A place where secrets became truth, where silence became justice. She'd bought a train station for $5 and discovered that sometimes the smallest investments yield the greatest returns. Not in money, but in courage. Not in property, but in redemption. As she drove toward her reclaimed farm with Whiskers purring in the passenger seat, Elena smiled. For the first time in 2 years, the future looked bright.